I'll just give the real brief context here of I heard your interview with Damian Stevens
Yeah.
on the MSP Mindset podcast. Loved what you shared. It was super helpful. Lots of good nuggets there.
Yeah.
But I have tons of questions,
Yeah. Yeah.
so this is my chance to ask some of them.
Sure.
The main ones that kind of rose to the top that I think would be really valuable to lots of people is the you described or mentioned a sales framework
Yeah.
that you said not a process but a framework where and you were getting better than 60% close rate on leads coming from a third party
Yeah.
agency. So my two big questions there. The first one is what was the sales framework, and then the second question is many MSPs work with third party marketing and lead gen agencies, and it
Yeah.
doesn't work well for them. And I think there's some reasons why, and it's not necessarily a problem with the agency. Although it's a complex relationship and a thing that happens
Right.
there that you were talking on that same interview about how a lot of people, small MSPs, hire their first salesperson, and that doesn't work out well because there's not definition, there's not support, there's not training, there's not clearly defined goals and way to measure and so on. And so what was it that contributed to your success with Marketopia? How much of that was Marketopia? What were you doing to make that go well? What can other
Yeah.
MSPs learn from that if they're looking to do third-party marketing and lead gen? So those are my two big questions.
Sweet. I'm gonna start with your process and framework question, if that's okay.
Yeah, that sounds
Uh,
great.
you can still hear me okay, too?
I can.
All right, cool. I had to push the mic away because I'm gonna end up drawing. I'll tee this up by answering the question or asking myself the question you just asked me so that this kind of turns into a cohesive
Yeah.
bit for you as well. But okay, so one of your questions, Andrew, was what was it about? Well, actually, what was the difference between looking at what I had done at the MSP where we built this out and labeling what we were doing as a framework versus a process? And first of all, before I kind of share my iPad and really start drawing really what I saw happening in the marketplace and was experiencing personally as well as like my journey, and I explained some of this on the previous show, but for those that didn't see that, my journey was 18 years spent inside MSP before moving on to co-founding CYFT to serve MSPs. The first 11 years was technical, right? So I kind of ascended the technical ladder, did a little bit of account management, VCIO in the middle, and then eventually was a sales rep and then a sales leader and built and grew sales teams. And so that's really the context of this. That really informs why I chose even the words that I did specific to a framework and not a process.
Yeah.
Because MSPs as an audience, as a people, as a personality traits, characteristics, like none of this is bad, but it is true. And I'm sorry, yes, I'm going to stereotype you and that's really me too, because I was one of those people. We were very binary, very black and white, very process procedure type people, even though we also sometimes have like this hint of defying authority or like not wanting to follow a process, right? Like it's this really interesting dichotomy between we're sort of like in and out zeros and ones people, and yet we want to operate in our own little like maverick bull in a china shop echo chamber. And so what I found in trying to run a process, specifically with salespeople in MSPs, was that processes were way too rigid to be received well by the audience. And in this case, the audience was a prospect. Now, what I mean by that is when it was designed in such a like strict way of like you go in and you have this very specific meeting and you have these 93 questions that you have to get through, like it was so robotic and so forced and so sterile and so awful that like that just wasn't going to work, right? And the other piece to that, I think, that I witnessed when I talked to peers and worked with other MSPs was like anytime they would get advice or a script or a process or something from someone else that it was working with, almost inevitably they'd go out in the field, they would do the thing as explicitly as it was defined, right? I read this sentence exactly word for word and I sounded robotic when I did it. And then it doesn't work out. And immediately it's like written off as this doesn't work. It's a failure. And so they don't try anymore. And so like those two things were sort of like the backdrop, if you will, for what I discovered or what I found out and like came to realize when I was running the sales to make it more successful. So like if we take that question, I would offer you this as my answer. There are three core buckets that I would place MSPs in. Ooh, MSP. I think it might be hitting. There we go. MSPs. As it relates, period, to their sales team at all, right? Like how do they approach sales? And to an extent, this graph is, or this matrix, if you will, is intended to be this way. So the very first, which is probably actually the majority of MSPs, don't have anything at all, which is why number one is intentionally left blank, right? There's literally like no process. Everything is one and done. It's never done the same way. It's never done the same way I did it last time. It's usually where you have like owner led. You know, that's basically the ecosystem that most MSPs live in at the owner led level, is that there isn't a process at all. I just I take the referral, I send the quote, I might follow up, and I get the business. That's kind of like the reality they live in. So let's put that on the shelf because that's not going to help anybody. Now you kind of look at this thing of like, okay, the other polar opposite side was to instigate the process and be so like draconian about it that it feels that way to the end user. And so maybe now you've implemented this 5-step process as an example, right? And to tie it to what I was doing, we pulled in something similar, right? And that might be something like your first time appointment, right? Moves to maybe like a full discovery meeting, which might go to some sort of assessment, which then probably goes to like scoping. And then like the end result is this proposal, which is also where most MSPs tend to fall off the line. It's just like I quoted it, I proposed it, and they don't allow themselves even the opportunity to run it through on perpetual follow-up to get the thing closed, right? So like this is intended to be a cliff, and it's really where most of the problem is. Now the other issue with that design is like this goes back to that binary thinking where the MSP thinks they're doing the right thing by like following and forcing the buyer through the check valves along the way of their system, right? Because it's like, well, no, I can't give you a quote because I have to do this, 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 this. Now, I'm not advocating for like blindly sending quotes way back over here at this stage of the relationship, but I am saying in all of these examples, there's actually two forces at play. And if I do it this way, I would say like this line down here running this way from beginning to end, that's like the MSP, whoa, writing like a kindergartner. That's your process, right? But what we completely neglect is what's actually happening on the top side, which is that the buyer has their own buying process. And when MSPs adopt process for the first time, they're so unforgiving in allowing the buyer to navigate the process they need to go through to get from I don't know you to I only want to work with you. And so that's really like this valley of despair is usually this version where they were doing this originally and they felt like it was working for them, but it was really referrals only. So
Right.
then they go to more like, I'm going to try to sell, whether that's you hired a sales rep, you hired an agency, you were doing some outbound generation, whatever. Now you realize, holy crap, I kind of have to bring some structure to this thing. And you shove this process in, and then you have this incongruent match between what the buyer wants and what you're forcing them to go through. And so the third version, which is the version that I built and we ran off of, right, was we actually threw away the word process entirely. Like it was banished from our vocabulary. We didn't use it at all, specifically and intentionally because it's too rigid. So just simply removing the word helped people get into the right mindset about how they were going to run their sales motion, which was a framework. And the framework was then adapted basically into the buying motions or the buying factors. And then we also built the perpetual follow-up on the end as well. So like nothing ever fell off. This is the first time I'm drawing it this way too, so apologize if it's a little off or a little sloppy, but hopefully it makes sense. The traditional process, whoops, excuse me, I was talking when I shouldn't have been. There we go. 90 days. 90 days is like the average sales cycle for MSPs for buyers that are, well, I should say for buyers, right? And there's a different graph that I can give you. Maybe I'll do that on the next page. But again, what we built on after proposal was an intentional follow-up process for 18 months after the proposal as well, for two reasons. One, we work and sell to an event-driven market, an event-driven sales motion, and two, no one else is. Right? So like you combine those two factors and you literally let them work for you, where if you stay in the game long enough, you're going to outperform the people that don't, and you're going to operate the same point of relevance, like top of mind for when the event happens. So then they pick up the phone. They're like, hey, I know we didn't do anything before. Can I get a refresh quote? We had XYZ happen, and you close it within a week. Right. So like that's a huge part, not to be overstated, is like this extra piece that we tacked on to our sales framework at the end was perpetual follow-up, relentless. Not relentless through like sales pressure and aggressive ridiculousness. Like no one wants that. It just simply meant we had a cadence that we continued to follow up with everyone that we had proposed to for 18 months and beyond to bring them back into the fold once the event occurred. And so the other big change that we made here between, oops, that shouldn't be red. We'll call it from process to framework was less rigidity, right? So if we go back to the buying sales process, the buyer's process, like what they want and how and why they want it, as compared to the MSP's process that they needed to get through. As soon as we introduced the concept of this is a framework, we could meet the buyer exactly where they are, exactly where they were, and then just navigate really cleanly. Like, let's say they started right there. Okay, great. Like, we could just navigate between this oscillating motion that eventually gets you to the proposal, but you might shortcut a piece of it because they're so much further down the buying journey than where your process needs to start, right? Like they're already they're problem aware, they're solution aware, and they're aware that you exist. They're 3 out of the 5 steps down the channel of like buying motions. Don't disrespect them by forcing them to go through steps 1, 2, and 3, because that's how they're going to feel. You're going to feel like you're doing your job. They're going to feel like you're wasting their time, which you are. And as a result, it's going to end in like a Howie Mandel no deal. And so you have to just understand that those were the forces that were happening between them. And ultimately, we ended up running and operating in this third zone, which was a framework, which was really just acknowledging there's 2 motions and power levels at play and allowing enough space for it to breathe and figure out, how are they, where are they, and where do we need to move them to?
Awesome. Makes a ton of sense. Um, if you have more to say there, don't let me derail you, but that sparks a few more questions for me. So,
Sure. Yeah, no, go ahead. Ask the questions.
at the risk of somebody taking this and going out and applying it too rigidly,
Right.
what was the cadence that you were using, and what did that perpetual follow-up actually look like as far as content and that kind of stuff? Like, what did that look like?
Yeah, so the piece that you're asking about was really like what were we doing? I'm going to redraw it like this so we have some more space. If that's the left-hand side, and now we're talking about really the 18 months that
18-month
landed
follow-up.
over
Yeah.
there, right? Okay. Yeah, so let's give some context. First of all, we had a monthly cadence, which was simply our newsletter, right? It wasn't even sales focused at all. So let's just call purple was the newsletter. The other thing that we had was when there were triggers or conditions that were relevant to the pain they had or the outcome that they were striving for, we would send that as just like a value added reach out. As an example, maybe they were on G Suite, they were having issues with G Suite, but they weren't ready to commit to moving over to Office 365, right? To accomplish XYZ reason, right? So, like, what was their pain specifically? And we would have that flagged to where we could have an intentional outreach where we saw an article or a thesis published or a use case or a case study, any of those kind of valid components that's more like, hey, this relevant thing that we talked about when we met, here's an example of me sending it to you right here. And then maybe there was another one over here because they just kind of came up. But again, it's not, hey, just following up, or hey, just following up, or have you made a decision yet, or did you go with the other provider? Like it's nothing that's the salesiness
Makes them
related.
sick of talking
It's
to you.
it's purely value, and it shows that you listen, you pay attention, you're good at what you do, and you're navigating that like solution channel, right? You're almost giving them the feeling of what it's like to be your customer without them being your customer. And in some ways, we're invoking some psychology that's making them regret the decision they didn't make and feel the pain of their current situation, which is not working with you. And then there were, a couple of other pieces, but like as far as really structured sales components, it would be third. That's yellow's a little too light, and I don't want to use red, so we'll go green. 30 days, sales rep after the decision to not go with you, essentially. Like 30 days, sales rep follows up. Hey, just checking in to see how that transition is going. Again, not salesy, not anything else. Just sort of checking the pulse of whatever decision they did make. Are they feeling the pain or are they not feeling the pain right now? And is there anything you can offer on from a guidance perspective on like, here's what you should do to make your onboarding smoother with the vendor that may not be leading the way for you? 90 days, very similar thing. It's been a quarter since we talked. Where are you in relation to the priorities that matter to you? Not how's IT going, right? Because in our sales process, we also focused a lot more on what mattered to our business or to the prospect's business than anything that we did. Meaning, like, what are your annual priorities this year? What is your success or failure measured by? Right? If the CEO walked in and cared about only three things, what are the three things that CEO is going to write on the whiteboard if I tell him to? Because nothing else matters, right? And I can't make them think my service matters more because it doesn't align to their priorities. So, like, figure out where they are and how they're going to make their decisions and why, and then just tie your services to being a benefit towards those things. And you're already like 80% beyond where most MSPs would try to try to sell. And then lastly, we would basically stay in a 90-day cadence, right? So every quarter was like a structured sales rep outreach, but then we had multiple other kinds of value-based components there. Because the other thing you have going on, right, is like your social channels are always putting stuff out. Maybe you have the email newsletter, right? But you've got blog posts that go in there at a different time. So like there's plenty of touch point opportunities that don't have to be salesy and yet stay relevant, stay beneficial. If you are useful, then they will not ignore you, right? So like that's sort of the litmus test is, am I being useful? And if not, you need to change the message until you are. And once you are, then they're always going to welcome it, right? And I try to put that in people's minds very similarly to, this will make sense for MSPs, like your phone starts ringing, you see the caller ID, right? Did you just gasp and make this huge exhale because you see the caller ID and it's like that one client that you wish you didn't have? It's the worst client or whatever, but you won't do anything about it? Or is it the one where you're like dropping your phone because you're so eager to answer? It's a similar emotion when we're the one calling. Like, who are we to that person? Do they want to pick up the phone? Do they want to interrupt the meeting that they're in to answer? Or do they want to throw the phone against the wall because you shouldn't have their number? It's a really easy way to like put yourself in the right frame of mind to do your outreach.
I love that example. Very viscerally easy
Yeah.
to connect with.
Yeah. And it's something that we all do, right? And I think that's the hardest part for some folks is like relating to the person on the other side of your email, your phone call, or your message. Like, just think about those same things that you go through and position yourself as the person you'd want to talk to. Yeah.
Yeah, that little flip, I just find so many people I'm interacting with just haven't made that flip.
Yeah.
When you're trying to talk about, well, I did this thing and I showed them this stuff and I sent them this quote and I don't understand why they're not buying. It's
Yeah.
like, well, would you buy if it was you? Like,
Yeah.
just flip it and think as your own business owner and how you interact with vendors and
Right.
like, yeah. So,
Yeah.
um, totally. I love what you're sharing. Um, so really connect with a lot of what you're sharing here. This makes a ton of sense, and I don't see MSPs doing this exactly.
Yeah.
To your point where, um, they're following up about the quote, and they're doing that annoying like,
Yeah.
and the shift to get them to stop reaching out and say, "Have you made a decision yet?" and instead look to contribute value to the conversation if they in the beginning of the sales process have done enough of that real discovery that's not about
Right.
how many endpoints do you have, but it's about what are your real priorities and pain points, and why did you have enough interest to even have this conversation in the first place? What's really going on?
Right.
And if you
Yeah.
got deep enough, then to be following up not with, "Hey, are you going to buy?" but, "Hey, here's something else that can contribute value to that conversation."
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Yeah. Like it shouldn't, none of the conversation should really ever be about not so much what is it that you do, but right, like it should at least probably be about 80-20, where you're figuring out where that prospect is in their world and in their reality and in their business, and then enabling them towards the goal that they want or that they have or that someone else has on them, and then just positioning yourself as the accelerant or a lever or something else to help them get to where they're already trying to go, because then you can flip the entire dynamic of the sales energy from, am I trying to explain to you how smart and intelligent I am about the things that I know to the point where I've convinced you to work with me? Or would you rather have a situation where all you're doing is facilitating the process and the motion of facilitating the part of someone moving towards the thing they already desire having, and you're just the guide through the process to like help them get through those mental blocks basically, but they're already moving towards it, they want the thing that you have. The emotional positioning of that is fundamentally different, right? It's a push not pull motion. And so it's more like I don't have to do either. I can just say, hey, we're going to go over here, we're going to turn left, and then we'll go around the corner in another couple blocks, and 3 minutes later we're going to turn right, but then we're going to be there. And it's okay, and it's where you wanted to go.
yeah, very different.
Mhm.
I think, listening to you say that too, one of the core things that underlies that is a like belief or identity or mentality shift where,
Yeah.
if you're coming into that conversation with um, this need to kind of prove value or show that the technical aspect is there, or overly focused on delivery or operations, or
Yeah.
showing off the technical piece, then it totally misses that conversation with the buyer about why the buyer is really here, which is not likely to be the technical details of your stack
Right.
or
Yeah, absolutely. And that reminds me of one of your earlier questions when we were chatting to grab the iPad again for this one, because it hits and illustrates exactly what you were talking about. It's not that one, but it's this one. So one of the first things that I realized once we had outsourced outbound telemarketing to source appointments for us, which I had never done that part. So like I had a sales process that was predictably and successfully producing results at a high level at 68%, but that was on inbound, right? Not all referrals, but it was inbound. So SEO was working,
yeah,
marketing was
yeah,
working, but it was all inbound. So then when we pivoted to add outbound as an outbound motion, obviously my sales process that then became the framework wasn't built to, I normally describe it as like I didn't have an on ramp to the interstate. It's like I had this great thing, but like, how do you get on it, and how do I connect the dots between the audience, which is now cold and or whatever tippy top of funnel, right, and like get them into this sales motion. And so I had to figure this out. Well, one of the ways that I did that was by being one of the ones on, rather than like handing off the cold appointments to my team to just, hey, go be successful. Like I was on every one of those calls for like the first 7 months anyway, as well, because I had to figure out what I didn't know. I didn't know. Like
Mm,
it
mm,
wasn't that I didn't trust my team to do it. It was that it was my responsibility to ensure that I built the framework and the process and the enablement and the documentation, like all of that stuff to empower my reps to be successful. And so one of the things I discovered really early on, probably 3 weeks in, so maybe, I don't know, 5, 10 phone calls right away, is this. And that is the fundamental difference between the way that we show up to those calls as compared to the client, or I should say prospect, right? So, what does the prospect care about and think about when they've agreed to your first time appointment or whatever you're calling it, a triage call, right? Triage or whatever. It's really just like the cold call, the first appointment itself. So let's just say it's a 15-minute meeting. What's the prospect really thinking about and wanting out of that 15-minute meeting? And what it is, truly, is information that will enable their ability to get to where they're trying to go. Like that's what they're coming for. They just want, like they have a problem they're trying to solve. They believe that you likely have the information that will help orient them, even if that's just like getting inside the ballpark. That's their expectation and their desired goal. What is it that the MSP wants when they're coming into that same initial call? They want a client, they
mm.
want MRR, right? They also want perfection, whether they're willing to admit it or not. And so naturally, like you're entering this world through two different frames, and it shows up that way. And as a result, like you're crossing those paths. The, this may as well be red, which again, if we're orienting ourselves, like the prospect comes to the meeting in a neutral way, right? Because they wanted the information and they wanted to be helped. And we immediately throw them into this climate that is, it's not that it's hostile, it's increasing their resistance level to being sold, right? Because we want the MRR, we want the outcome, we want the client. They don't want that. And so we end up in this totally mixed bag where, like, at best, we can maybe have them leave that conversation in a neutral way. But odds are, because of the way that we've approached this conversation, because we wanted all those things, is we immediately started vomiting all that crap that increased their resistance level. And so, like, we leave those meetings as MSPs being like, why did I even get this phone call? And we blame it on the caller. Like, they didn't even know I was there. They thought I sold leather shoes or something along those lines, right? And then we just get upset, and that's kind of it. And it's like, well, maybe it wasn't that at all. Maybe they're just so much higher on the ladder of awareness of where they are and what they're trying to do. And we came in guns blazing because we're used to selling referrals that are so much farther down the buying process that, like, it was uncomfortable for both of us. And they were as high as possible on the reservation side and the resistance side, that, like, you got the double stiff arm, which is also why they're not going to call back when you call into them, or they're not going to answer your email that you send them after the call, or like they might, but it's just going to fizzle out because they know that you don't have the endurance to stay it anyways, and they don't really want to work with you because of the way you showed up to that conversation. And so, to kind of tie a bow on that, like it does come back down deeper to psychology and understanding people. It's not so much like the golden rule of treat people the way you want to be treated, but like it's not that big of a stretch for someone in a sales role to stop long enough and think about how they like to buy and then reframe their own actions to support a buying motion and not a selling motion. You know, one of the things that I like to say specific on this topic, um, I think Nate Nosrell is the person that I got this from, but he has a saying, if it was right, well, the saying is right. I think that's who said it was that sales reps don't close deals, buyers do. And when I heard that for the first time, I was like, oh, that's cute until it like hit me. Like, oh, like that's exactly right, right? Because I'd identified that there were these two processes, but I'd never had it said that way before. And then as soon as I heard it, I couldn't unhear it because that's the case. Like the only urgency that matters to the buyer is theirs. Um, and you have to facilitate their process to execute an agreement. And so, like, once you understand that it's the buyer that closes the deal and not the seller, approaching sales as a buying motion is just so much more empowering than a sales motion. And that was a big part of the like
Mm,
essence of our
mm.
sales team for the success that we had.
Yeah, I love that. One of the kind of most basic mindset shifts that I talk about with clients and that I try to help them do, just get them DMing people on LinkedIn, just like a real basic exercise of
Yeah.
DMing prospects on LinkedIn, not talking about tech, but asking
Yeah.
them, what are the top of mind issues? What's really going on for you? In a not related to IT way. And then just do that enough times that you start to see the patterns for, let's say your, ideal clients are attorneys with, uh, 30 lawyers in front or something like that, whatever your niche is, and start talking to those people.
Mm-hmm.
And then you realize, oh, there's certain things that's top of mind for almost all of them.
Yeah.
And so then I was on that call you did last week, I think it was, that by the title you were just going by, the seller
Oh, sure.
don't
Yeah. The
close,
awareness. Yeah.
deals buyers do. And that was great. I loved when you pulled out the picture of the CEO brain and all the stuff going on in the CEO brain. I was like, that's
Yeah.
it exactly. Like that's
Yeah.
exactly what I'm trying to communicate with clients is
Mm-hmm.
you become instantly relevant when you talk about the thing that they're already talking about.
Yeah.
And not just relevant, but trusted. You've
Mm-hmm.
done work to find out, you've already kind of extended yourself in a certain way to get
Yeah.
relevant to them, and they immediately trust you in a way that they completely don't trust you if you show up and you're irrelevant to them,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah. The thing that I took where I came up with that, where I had that light bulb moment was probably at this point, maybe 12-ish years ago, when I first started studying marketing. Um, One of the places that I started on was the I Love Marketing podcast by Dean Jackson and that sucks. The other guy's name slips me. Joe Polish. And
I love
Dean was
Joe
talking
Polish.
about
He's a
when
great guy.
he had found or that like where marketing changed for him was when he was studying Robert Collier. And one of the sayings that Robert Collier is known for is to enter the conversation that's already happening inside your prospect's mind, right? And that's just a succinct way of saying like the CEO brain and what you're illustrating, which is this other saying that I can't remember who has this. It's not my original thought. It's attributed to whoever it is out there, but it is the when you can when you can articulate someone's problem more effectively than they can, they will subconsciously and automatically attribute you with the solution, even if you don't solve it, right? And that is like one of the most powerful psychological hacks that you can use to position a complex thing to be sold, which is managed services, right? Like if I asked any one of the MSPs that are listening to this show to tell me what it is that you do, probably it's going to start with, well, it's complicated, or oh, it's hard to explain, or it's this or that. Like you don't have that simplicity to really articulate it because it's a service and it's complex and it might feel a little bit different to everyone you're selling it to. And and you have to like go back then to that last two things, right? Enter the conversation already happening in your prospect's mind and be able to articulate that specific persona's problems better than they can, and they will subconsciously and automatically attribute you with the solution. Those two psychological pieces alone inside your sales framework will increase your win rate by, let's just say, exponentially, right? I mean, I feel confident saying 30 to 40% increase in just those two things alone at the beginning of your process, because you have to earn the opportunity to have the rest of the sales process with them, right? And if you lose that up front, then it's just a numbers game at that point.
Yeah, yeah, love it. I feel like we're already answering the other question about Marketopia, and there may be other things you want to contribute to that conversation, but I feel like there's a major nugget here of the way that you're engaging with those kind of cold leads, and that so many MSPs are getting wrong because they're showing up with their own agenda that doesn't align with the buyer at that stage in the buying process, and so there's just that instant mismatch and
there's a big
resistance, etc.
There's a big piece that you're right, we've kind of already covered, but there's this other illustration that I'll show you on the iPad too, because this is really where I started to see a lot more of the unlock in our outbound sales motion when we were doing the outsourced telemarketing. And that is this concept of understanding the weight of your ask and like realizing that every part of your sales process, whether it's your go blue, whether it's your first time appointment, I'm going to change the size of the marker so it actually looks decent. My handwriting's bad enough. First time appointment, or triage call, or proposal meeting. Like, you got to really understand every piece that you're putting together in your sales motion has a weight associated with it. The illustration I like to give oftentimes, I don't know if I said it on that last call, but MSPs need to think of themselves in a sales conversation as having like an armful of bowling balls, right? And the dynamic, the interaction between you and Andrew, me and Andrew, is every time I'm speaking or like emphasizing a point or telling them, like I'm handing you one of those bowling balls, right? Well, MSPs, again, we're overly verbose and we're more predisposed to try to verbally demonstrate how smart we are about the thing that it is we're talking about. So then consider that those bowling balls are now covered in Vaseline, right? Like, that's more of the illustration that you need to have as the interaction of like, okay, every piece of context that I'm putting on them is that much more of a burden for them to deal with. Well, if you use that illustration in the backdrop of what's your call to action or what's your ask, you need to deconstruct your entire process into the smallest and lightest and most congruent next step that you earn the opportunity to continue to go through the whole thing, right? So let's just break this down. I usually put all of those into this bucket and I say, what's your ask? It's an easier way to think about it. And then when you put your ask right here, now you have to be thinking about something, make it relevant to the outbound calling, right? Well, over here on this outbound calling lever, if I'm trying to get a 60-minute meeting on a cold call with someone who doesn't know me and didn't ask for this phone call, as compared to like what I offer, which is my MSP offering, make it universal. Like, which way is this thing going to go? Right? And then we get really pissed off as MSPs when the weight of that ask is so disproportionately off that you're not getting any meetings, probably, right? Now, let's make this a little more relevant to cold calling, because hopefully you're not asking for a 60-minute call. The reason I say that, though, is most MSPs they use this filter of like, my time is extremely valuable, so I'm not going to come meet with you if you won't give me 60 minutes. Good luck trying to grow. Like,
that just isn't how it works.
Understand the weight of this thing, right? And so let's take out the time frame and do this a little bit different, because this, I think, is the problem specifically if you're starting to do your outbound motion is, okay, Mr. Telemarketer, I'm only going to take prospects that have 33 or more people. They're willing to pay $200 a seat, right? And they're within 1.3 miles of my office. Like, we come up with these absolutely ridiculous constraints because it's what we want. Like we strive for this utopian perfection or whatever. But like again, either understand that the TAM, the total addressable market that has those in it is probably 3, maybe,
I was gonna
right?
say.
You know? And so if we take that same visual, the same concept, and you say, okay, in my cold calling plan, instead of trying to ask for a 30-minute meeting, right, which might be out here, 30 minutes, maybe I'll ask, this was one of the things we changed. What happens when I start asking for a 15-minute meeting? And then going a step further, because I can't stop A/B testing, what happens when we ask for a 7-minute intro call, like a quick touch point, basically? Well, first of all, the size of those bowling balls and the amount of Vaseline I can put on it to make it difficult for the prospect to say yes or no to or carry obviously gets lower and lower. But I'm still out over here trying to just offer my MSP services, right? Well, if you wanted to make that box even smaller, maybe we'll do it this way, right? Like I'm trying to offer my big old MSA out the gate. Like, what do you mean you don't want to have a phone call about the MSA, right? Like, well, what if instead it was this? I mean, I don't want to use the word like ebook, right? Because hopefully no one's schlepping those around here for this case. But like, it can't like change the value you're providing to be so much more congruent with where they are in their motion as well. Because if we can make them slide the weight, the 7-pound weight this direction on the fulcrum, you know what else changes from a physics standpoint? It actually doesn't weigh as much, right? So if we can bring the ask that we're asking, which is maybe a 7-minute meeting or a 15-minute meeting, and then slide it towards us with something that's actually valuable and attractive. Maybe it's a scoping guide for whatever, right? If it's a construction firm, maybe you can come up with something that's valuable that you've already learned from your other construction clients. Like every construction company should have this evaluation check sheet for like how to appropriately deal with OneDrive in the field. Whatever the thing is, give them that, and now you have those forces working towards each other this way because this is the point of conversion, and the weight needs to be balanced anyways. So if you reduce the weight of your ask and you can inch them closer to the center of the fulcrum, like conversion will begin to happen naturally rather than it being entirely unnatural from the beginning. And so I kind of went like high level and low level on that, but one of the things that we were constantly tweaking and adjusting while we were calling was, what's my ask? How heavy is it? How can I reduce the risk of that specific ask? And I'm always going to be A/B testing it, right? A control against the baseline and figuring out how do we go so much better towards it. And then subsequently, right? So we pretty much standardized on a 15-minute call. The 15-minute call, we obviously had to change what we showed up to talk about and say. And guess what pretty much wasn't on the agenda? What we did or how we do it as a managed service provider. Like it was really just about identifying their priorities, feeling our way into what we suspected their pain to be, and more importantly, are we or are we not even a good fit for you? Right? And like that was the success criteria for that first call. And when we did that, plus I had 3 full-time callers, you know, we were averaging 38 appointments per month. I don't have any data on this, but like if I polled the 150 MSPs that exist in the world, how many net new sales opportunities they're getting a year, it probably isn't even 38, right? Well, we had scaled a system that we were leveraging to I was getting 38 of those a month. And again, this isn't about me being brilliant or smart or amazing. Like one, opportunities, right? Like how many at bats was I and my team getting as compared to you? And so I was really just compressing time by increasing the volume of opportunity that we had. So much so that when you run that many opportunities through the sales system we were deploying at a high win rate, you know, we were onboarding at our peak between 4 and 6 MSPs or customers a month at that MSP. And so, you know, growth was insane. Over 28 months, we signed just under 3 million in ARR using that process, right? Which again, just adding the 3 to the 5 we already were, but like if you just took a net new MSP from scratch, right, and added 3, like you've already surpassed 80% of the MSPs out there, because 80% of the MSPs are sub 1 million in top line revenue. And so like that's
Yeah,
the kind of growth that's possible, but it's not possible doing it the way that most of the industry teaches you to do it.
totally makes sense. Um, the Wow, you see, you just shared a lot of pieces there. I connected with a number of the, pieces of what you're saying that I've seen play out in
Mhm.
different ways.
Yeah.
Uh, the One of the things that kind of stuck with me, one of those, yeah, I think you said, you can't unhear it once you've heard it.
Yeah.
Uh, that you're not selling the final product, the end result. You're always
Yeah.
just selling the next step in the sales cycle. That's all you're selling. So you're
Yeah.
selling them getting on the next call or the first
Right.
call, or
Yeah.
can I send you a resource that will help you with that issue? You're just selling that next thing. Then that thing is going to sell the next thing. Then that thing is going to sell
Yeah.
the next thing. But if you're thinking I need to sell this deal, you're
Yeah.
you're in the wrong mindset from the start.
Exactly. Your only responsibility is to earn the right to sell the next thing. Right? That's the balance between those two things, right? And so in order to earn the right, like you have to show up the right way with the right intention, with the right next step component. And it's literally just those two things. Show up to earn the right for the next conversation, the next step in the framework, right? It's not about showing up to the first time appointment with the project team's 19-point checklist from Jiffy Lube about whether or not their thing is going to be amazing or not, right? Like, how many endpoints do you have? What kind of endpoints are they? Are they all in this location or are they in that location? How long have you been business? Like, one of my biggest pet peeves ever coming from MSP, because it's the only thing I've done professionally, was never ask a question that you should already know the answer to or that you can find the answer to, right? So like just even that alone with these stupid checklists and like the tech brain version of showing up to a sales conversation where it's like, I mean, I'm trying to even think of a good example to make you feel it as an MSP listening to this thing. Perhaps let's look at a critical scenario. Maybe you have like a flat tire on the interstate, and maybe you even have like a roadside assistance program. Well, let's imagine that you now have a flat tire, you're on the interstate, you don't have any of the tools, and you do have roadside assistance, and you call the roadside assistance company, and one, you get an automated attendant. Automated attendant walks you through like 17 steps on the auto attendant, none of which are relevant to you being in distress on the side of the road, needing help until you get to the 18th option on the phone system. So you click number 18 to get to the next step. And then it's like 3 more choices. Well, are you in the state that you are licensed in? Or are you traveling somewhere else? Like, you know what I mean? Just think through how frustrating and painful really living in today's reality is with tech, and then superimpose or transpose that concept into how you approach your actual sales conversations. Like that similar as maybe over exaggerated as that example might even be. Imagine how bewildered and frustrated and annoyed the prospect is trying to come up with all the answers that they don't know anyway for your checklist, just for you to be able to say, great, thank you. Like now we can move forward with the assessment where I already would have figured all that stuff out on my own. Like it, that's the stuff that drives me insane about how
You're asking
most,
them questions that they're coming to you to help them answer.
right.
Yeah.
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 And we do it with a bit of an elitist attitude too. Like, well, what do you mean you don't know if you're Office 365 or G Suite?
You should know this stuff.
Yeah, exactly. Like, and you know who doesn't even need to ask that question at all? You, because you could do a NS lookup on their domain and like figure it out, or at least see that they're behind a spam filter. And then, you know what I mean? Like, it's mind blowing. But the reason that it's maybe not your fault as an MSP who's listening to this, and hopefully, you aren't to the point of hating me at this point, but it is what it is, because it's true, is it's not your fault because one, there aren't that many great examples out there for MSPs of one, how to market, two, how to sell. that aren't just selling you the stuff from 15 years ago that hasn't changed, even though the market has completely changed. So like you've tried the thing, you've done the thing, didn't work, you touched the stove and you don't want to touch it anymore. I get it. Okay. I lived that too, which is why I had to figure it out on my own with my team. But the other side is vast majority of MSPs grow through referrals, right? Or at least warm introductions.
Yeah,
So if we go
absolutely.
back to the very beginning of the conversation, like that's not selling. That's order taking. And what do you do when you're taking orders? It's just like ordering at a restaurant, right? I'm gonna have the ribeye medium, and I want a salad instead of fries, like and then okay, great transaction, boom, it comes out, and hopefully there's some decent service along with it. But like it's
They've
really
already
about
walked into your
the
restaurant at
interaction.
that point,
Yeah,
right? Like
and so
selling would be to get them to come to the restaurant.
yeah, exactly. That's the thing. And then we apply the same concept totally out of context, right? So now it's like
Walking up to somebody on the
a
street and
net
asking
new
them what they
outbound.
want
Yeah,
for their order.
exactly. Like, hey, I want my ribeye medium. They're like, the hell? Like, first of all, we're not in a restaurant. Second of all, I don't touch red meat. And third, like, I don't even know what cut a ribeye is compared to some other one. Like, okay, like you're so out of line in that like context that professional selling and sales is an abstract thing inside this industry that isn't used to it as well. But order taking is like, how many endpoints do you have? Basically, you're building your quote in your mind, right? You shouldn't be asking quote building questions. That might be the simplest way of saying what I'm trying to say or what we're talking about, Andrew, is
Yeah,
like, do not ask quote building questions. There's a different way to figure it out. And it's also not at all relevant. And if you ask those questions in the first conversation that we have, if you're the prospect, Andrew, and those are my questions to you, like, what does that feel like? I'm taking your order and I'm pre-building a quote, and we haven't even established that you have a problem, that you can trust me, that I'm even trustworthy, that I have a solution that actually works, that I can execute on half the stuff I'm committing to. You know what I mean? Like there's so much of that that you have to be willing to work through. But a lot of those MSPs that have grown through word of mouth, like you haven't been put in those other situations yet. And likely when they are, you don't get any of the feedback of why they just ghosted you. And so you really can't learn
I
from that either, right? So there's a process there that works.
love in your story you're sharing about the guy, I think Ryan was his name, who
Yeah,
took you
yeah.
aside after you lost
Mm-hmm.
his business and told you all the stuff
Yeah.
that you did wrong
Yeah. Because
in
I,
that
I mean, I
process.
would have never,
What gold that is, huh?
yeah, I never would have been able to see the world through his eyes at that point, right? Which the biggest blessing ever was that he gave me 80% of the roadmap that every buyer was navigating through. But again, I came up on the tech side of the house. So I brought a hammer and everything was a nail. And I didn't understand that there was a more efficient way to do it with a screw or that the longevity would last longer and why I would choose a Phillips over a straight edge. Like, because I didn't have the worldview or the exposure to sales before. I mean, you heard this story, but for those that don't, when I was in the VCIO seat, I was essentially the sales solutions engineer for my sales rep team. So I was getting brought on all the sales calls anyway for a year and a half, something like that. And I took for granted like me being on stage for that small little moment and thinking I understood everything that needed to happen because a lot of the closing was done in those conversations, but I still didn't have to do any of the sales stuff, like the actual sales rep stuff, until I was no longer a VCIO and I was a sales executive and I had to figure all that out on my own. And so I showed up as the version that I knew, which was my VCIO self, thought I had Ryan in the bag, got the call that he went a different direction, got the wind knocked out of me. My blood went cold. I was probably flush. I was probably like all of the things that you go through as a rep. And then realized like, how could I have been so far off? Right. And more importantly, I felt like I did everything that I'd been doing for the last year and a half and I got a different result. This isn't going to work. So we had actually built enough rapport during the sales process that not only did he field my phone call when I called him back, but then he invited me into his office and gave me everything from his perspective, which is really the gold that enabled and empowered like the continuous iterative improvement that became our sales framework moving forward.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
I want to be respectful of your time here. We're 2 minutes to the hour. Do you want a hard stop here in 2 minutes?
Let me check. I think I might have yeah, I do have a hard stop in 2 minutes.
Okay. Um, then what do you wish I had asked you that I haven't asked yet?
Hmm. Not necessarily what's it take to be successful, and that's not speaking from an ego perspective. But remember, I was an MSP who had struggled with two different outbound tele agencies before I moved to my third one, and so it wasn't even like this stuff just doesn't work. The thing I would tell you, as the owner or the decision maker who is trying to figure out how to grow, is that you have to bring the appropriate amount of commitment to the decision of the direction you're trying to go. And by that, I mean talent, time, talent, treasure, right? You have to be able to emotionally disconnect from the dollars that you're investing in the growth engine of your business for at least 6 months before you start emotionally reacting to cutting that check and trying to tear it all down. Because when you build an outbound motion, it's going to take at least 6 months to get up. And then every single day is a value added day into your pipeline, into your list, into the data set, into everything else. And so don't stop, keep going. But get your hands dirty, show up, don't abdicate the responsibility, get in there, make it your own to own, and don't be afraid to fail and fail fast.
Awesome. Love it. Yeah, you mentioned something similar on that call, the kind of get
Yeah.
ready to spend. I think you said 3 times what you think it's gonna cost in
In
time and
time.
money.
Yeah.
Um, and if you're not ready to do that, then don't do it.
Right. Yep. Exactly.
Awesome. Thank you so much for your time, Jeff.
Yeah,
Really enjoyed
absolutely.
this conversation with you.
Yeah, hopefully it was helpful for you.
Very helpful.
All
Lots
right.
of nuggets here. I'll hit
Yeah.
you up later and let you know some feedback and stuff that really helps. So
Okay.
thanks a
Sounds
lot.
great.
Take
Yep.
care for
Thanks,
now.
Andrew.